There are some things we convince ourselves are just tricks of the mind. The creak of a floorboard in the dead of night, the soft rustle of curtains when no breeze stirs, or the distant sound of footsteps when you know you're alone. But what if those sounds aren't just your imagination? What if something is lurking, just out of sight, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal itself? Jason had lived in his old house for years, finding comfort in its creaking floors and the soft groans of wood that settled each night. It was a quiet place, a sanctuary from the chaos of the world, or so he thought. The noises began subtly, almost imperceptibly. A faint tapping here, a creak there. He brushed them off as the normal sounds of an aging house, too tired from work to care much. But then the footsteps started. Every night, just as he was about to drift off to sleep, Jason would hear them. Slow, deliberate steps moving down the hallway outside his bedroom door. At first, he tried to ignore it, chalking it up to his overactive imagination. But the footsteps grew louder, more distinct, until it was impossible to dismiss them as anything but real. He would lie in bed, holding his breath, listening to the slow, measured pace of those footsteps. They would stop just outside his bedroom door, lingering there as if whatever was out there was waiting for him to make the first move. He would finally gather the courage to get up, heart pounding in his chest, and fling open the door. But each time there was nothing, just the empty hallway stretching out before him. This nightly routine continued for weeks, driving Jason to the brink of exhaustion and paranoia. He began sleeping with the light on, hoping the soft glow would ward off whatever was haunting him. But the footsteps persisted, growing more insistent, as if taunting him, daring him to find the source. One night, the footsteps were louder than ever, almost deafening in the quiet of the night. They were closer this time, too close. Jason could feel the floorboards vibrating under the weight of each step, the sound reverberating through his bones. He knew he had to confront whatever was causing them. He couldn't take the terror any longer. With trembling hands, he reached for the baseball bat he kept by his bed and slowly approached the door. His heart was racing, sweat trickling down his forehead as he pressed his ear to the door. The footsteps stopped abruptly, as if whoever, or whatever, was on the other side knew he was there. Jason's hand shook as he gripped the doorknob, and with a deep breath, he threw the door open. The hallway was empty, just as it always was. But this time, something was different. The air was thick, oppressive, and a chill ran down his spine as he stepped out into the hallway. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and he knew without a doubt that he was not alone. He slowly made his way down the hallway, bat in hand, his eyes scanning every shadow for movement. And then he saw it, a dark figure standing at the far end of the hallway, shrouded in shadow. It was barely visible, just a darker shape against the darkness. But it was there, watching him. Jason's breath caught in his throat as the figure began to move, gliding toward him without a sound. The closer it got, the colder the air became, until it was almost unbearable. He wanted to run, to turn and flee back to the safety of his room, but his feet were rooted to the spot, frozen in terror. The figure stopped just a few feet away, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then slowly, it began to reach out, a shadowy hand extending toward Jason, the air around it swirling with an unnatural chill. He tried to move, to swing the bat, to do anything, but his body refused to obey. He could only stand there, paralyzed, as the hand came closer and closer. At the last possible second, the lights flickered and the figure vanished, leaving Jason standing alone in the hallway. He gasped for breath, his heart pounding as he stumbled back into his room, slamming the door shut behind him. The footsteps didn't return that night, nor the next, but the damage was done. The fear had taken root, and no amount of rationalizing could shake the feeling that he was being watched. Days passed, and Jason found himself avoiding the hallway after dark, unable to shake the memory of that shadowy figure. He tried to convince himself it was a dream, a hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion. But deep down, he knew the truth. Something was in his house, something that had revealed itself to him in the dead of night, and he had no idea how to stop it. As the nights grew longer, the footsteps eventually returned, quieter this time, but still there. They were a constant reminder that whatever had been in the hallway that night hadn't left. It was waiting, biding its time until it decided to show itself again. And Jason knew, with a sinking dread, that the next time it did, he might not be so lucky. From that night on, Jason's sleep was never the same. The shadows in his house seemed to grow darker, more menacing, and the once comforting creaks and groans of the old house now sent shivers down his spine. He was no longer alone in his own home, and the fear of what lurked in the darkness consumed him. No matter how hard he tried to escape it, the shadow in the hallway was always there, just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to step back into the light. And each time the footsteps started again, Jason couldn't help but wonder if this time the shadow would let him live to see another day. It all started with the smallest of movements in the shadows just at the edge of her vision. Nora would catch it, a flicker, something out of place. At first, she thought it was just her imagination playing tricks on her as the nights grew longer and the wind howled louder outside her window. But soon, that unsettling feeling of being watched became too hard to ignore. Every night, as Nora sat by the window, she noticed a figure in the distance. At first, it was barely noticeable, just a dark silhouette far off in the shadows. But with each passing night, the figure seemed to be getting closer. It moved so slowly, almost imperceptibly, that it was easy to dismiss. Yet, it was always closer than the night before. Nora's unease grew into dread. She locked all the doors and windows, made sure the curtains were drawn tight, and even considered calling someone to stay with her. But who would believe her? The creeping figure in the dark wasn't exactly a cause for alarm to anyone but her. She decided to keep it to herself, hoping it was just some sort of bizarre hallucination. One evening, after locking out the house as usual, she noticed something different. The figure wasn't just closer, it was much closer. It had moved from the distant tree line and was now just beyond the edge of her garden. Panic gripped her as she realized that it was no trick of the light. There was something or someone out there, and it was coming for her. That night, sleep was impossible. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind sent her heart racing. She lay in bed, clutching the covers, her eyes wide open, staring at the shadows on the walls. The figure dominated her thoughts, its slow, deliberate approach. She could feel its presence even when she closed her eyes. It was as if it was already inside the house, lurking just out of sight. Morning brought little relief. The figure was gone, as it always was by daylight. But the fear stayed with her, gnawing at her sanity. She tried to go about her day as usual, but the thought of nightfall filled her with dread. She knew it would be back, closer than before, and she didn't know how to stop it. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Nora prepared herself for another sleepless night. She checked every lock, every window. The house was secure, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that it wouldn't be enough. When she looked out the window, she saw it again. The figure was at the edge of her lawn now, standing perfectly still, watching. She called the police, her voice trembling as she described the situation. They arrived quickly, searching the property and the surrounding area, but there was no trace of anyone. They assured her that everything was fine, that she was safe. But as soon as they left, she knew they were wrong. The figure was back the very next night, closer still. It was at the foot of her garden now, nearly at her doorstep. Nora's fear turned to terror. It was no longer just a figure in the distance. It was something real, something with intent. She could feel its malevolence, its desire to reach her. That night, she couldn't stay in the house. She grabbed her keys, fled to her car, and drove aimlessly, just to get away. But no matter how far she went, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was following her. She could see it in her mind's eye, creeping closer and closer. She didn't know where to go or who to turn to. All she knew was that she couldn't go back home. When dawn finally broke, she returned, exhausted and on the edge of collapse. The figure was gone again, but she knew it would return. She knew she couldn't keep running. She had to face it, whatever it was. That night, she waited by the window, every muscle in her body tense. And there it was, closer than ever, just a few feet from her door. Nora's fear was overwhelming, but she forced herself to move. She had to know what it was, why it was tormenting her. She opened the door, stepped out into the night. The figure didn't move, didn't react. It was as if it had been waiting for this moment. As she approached, she could finally see it clearly. A dark, twisted shadow of a person, faceless and hollow. It reached out, and the world seemed to tilt. Everything went black. When Nora woke up, she was inside her house, lying on the floor. The figure was gone, but something had changed. She felt different, as if a part of her had been taken, or perhaps something had been left behind. She looked around, and everything seemed normal, but she knew that it wasn't over. She could still feel it, lurking just beyond the edges of her vision, waiting for the right moment to return, waiting for her to be alone again. In the days that followed, Nora couldn't shake the lingering dread that had settled deep within her. The house, once her safe haven, now felt like a trap, each shadow a reminder of the creeping figure that had haunted her nights. Even in broad daylight, she found herself glancing over her shoulder, expecting to see it standing there, just out of sight. It started as a faint tapping, so quiet that it was easy to dismiss as the wind or the house settling. But soon, the taps grew louder, more insistent, and always came at exactly the same time, midnight. Stella, a single mother living in a small, creaky house on the outskirts of town, couldn't shake the unease that crept over her every night as the clock struck 12. She would lie in bed, eyes wide open, listening to the rhythmic knock, 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 her heart pounding in sync with the sound. For the first few nights, Stella tried to ignore it, convincing herself it was nothing more than a tree branch scraping against the window, or perhaps some nocturnal animal searching for food. But deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. The knock was too deliberate, too precise, and it always came from the front door. She started to dread the nights, the hours leading up to midnight, filled with a growing sense of anxiety. She would check and double-check the locks, peek out the windows, and even leave lights on throughout the house. But no matter what she did, the knocking always came, steady and relentless. After a week of sleepless nights, Stella decided she couldn't take it anymore. She had to know who, or what, was behind that door. She stayed up, sitting in the living room, her eyes glued to the clock as it approached midnight. Her heart pounded in her chest, each tick of the clock feeling like a countdown to something terrible. When the clock struck 12, the knocking started. It was louder than ever before, echoing through the quiet house like a sinister drumbeat. Stella's breath caught in her throat, her hands trembling, as she stood up and approached the door. She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the doorknob. Every instinct told her not to open it, to walk away and pretend she hadn't heard a thing. But she couldn't. The knocking was almost hypnotic, drawing her closer, demanding that she answer it. Finally, with a deep breath, she twisted the knob and pulled the door open. The cold night air rushed in, sending a shiver down her spine. No one was there. The street was empty, the night silent except for the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. Stella's heart pounded in her ears as she looked around, searching for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Just the darkness and the cold. She stepped back, ready to close the door, when she felt it, a sudden, overwhelming chill that seeped into her bones. It was as if the cold itself had entered the house, an icy presence that made her breath visible in the air. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and she felt a deep, primal fear that she couldn't explain. Stella slammed the door shut and locked it, her hands shaking uncontrollably. But the cold remained, a lingering presence that seemed to fill every corner of the house. She could feel it watching her, surrounding her, waiting. Desperate, she checked every room, every closet, but there was nothing to be found. Yet she knew she wasn't alone. The cold was everywhere, pressing against her, making it hard to breathe. She tried to ignore it, wrapping herself in blankets and turning on every light in the house, but the chill only grew stronger. Sleep was impossible. Stella sat in the living room, her eyes darting around the room, waiting for something, anything to happen. But the house remained eerily silent, the only sound the ticking of the clock as it crept closer to morning. When dawn finally broke, the cold began to dissipate, leaving Stella exhausted and terrified. She didn't know what had happened, but she was certain that whatever had entered her home was still there, lurking just out of sight. For the next few nights, the knocking continued, but Stella refused to open the door again. The cold presence returned each night, growing stronger, more oppressive, until she felt like she was suffocating in her own home. It was as if the house itself had turned against her, trapping her in a nightmare she couldn't escape. One night, unable to bear it any longer, Stella decided to leave. She packed a bag and drove to a hotel, desperate for some relief from the terror that had taken over her life. But even there, the cold followed her, seeping into her room, turning her sanctuary into a frozen prison. No matter where she went, the knocking found her. It echoed in her mind, relentless, driving her to the brink of madness. She knew she couldn't run from it, that it would follow her wherever she went. The icy presence was a part of her now, a shadow she couldn't escape. In the end, Stella had no choice but to return home. The knocking was waiting for her, louder and more insistent than ever. She sat by the door, too tired and too scared to move, as the clock struck 12 and the knocking began once more. This time, she didn't open the door. She simply sat there, letting the cold wash over her, feeling it seep into her very soul. And as the night wore on, she realized with a chilling certainty that the knocking would never stop. It would follow her forever, a reminder that some doors, once opened, can never be closed. As the nights dragged on, Stella's resolve began to weaken. The relentless knocking and the suffocating cold were wearing her down, eroding her will to resist. She found herself sitting by the door each night, drawn to the sound that haunted her every waking moment. It was as if the very act of resisting was feeding the darkness that had invaded her life. And so one night, with her sanity hanging by a thread, Stella did the unthinkable. She reached for the doorknob, her hand trembling not with fear, but with a desperate need for the nightmare to end one way or another.